So here I'm going to describe natural law to you. This definition of natural law is something that a lot of people mistake for another form of philosophy called law of nature, and I want to make sure to get this cleared up. So natural law is looking at nature to try to determine what God's law is. How can you do that? Well, when what someone makes reveals a little bit about the person who made it. So in nature, we can learn a little bit about what God's law is. In the case of law of nature, that is trying to look at nature to try to determine right and wrong without consideration of God. And these two philosophical approaches lead to very different conclusions. I've seen a lot of people try to suggest that they ultimately lead to the same conclusions, and that is just absolutely not the case. They end up very differently, very opposing points of view about right and wrong, and I'm going to show that to you. Before I get deeply into that, I want to give you 5 foundations for natural law. And first one is God exists. The second one is God created us with a plan. The third one is God gave us the free will to cooperate with or resist God's plan. Now, why would God allow us to resist His plan? Is because it is also God's plan that we have the free will to resist God's plan. How can you love unless you have the free will to love? Point number 4. As individuals and as a community, we cannot experience true fulfillment without cooperating in God's plan. And the final point is we have the ability to discover the direction of God's plan in nature, even though we don't see the end. I've seen a lot of people use a very common counter-example to natural law to try to discredit natural law. And I call it the airplane example. They always use the airplane, right? They say it's not natural for humans to fly, but we fly in airplanes. And therefore, flying in airplanes is against natural law. Well, this reason doesn't hold out. And in order for me to show that to you, you need to understand the philosophical definition of substance and accident that I explained in a previous video, Philosophy of Christianity Part 1. If you haven't seen that, please do. But if you've watched that, you may recall that one of the accidents is location. Location is accidental to human nature, not substantial to it. So it doesn't violate the substantial part of our human nature to ride an airplane, because an airplane just gives us the ability to be in locations that we normally couldn't be. So that is not contrary to natural law to fly in an airplane. But since we're on the subject of airplanes, I'm going to use an airplane to explain natural law. So in the case of an airplane, you might be interested to know that an airplane itself is actually protected by a form of natural law as long as it has an owner. If the airplane doesn't have an owner, then we can do anything we want to it. But if it has an owner, there are certain implied rules about what we can and can't do to the airplane, and this is rooted in the nature of the airplane itself, right? For example, if someone were to put water in the gas tank, the owner can sue, even though the owner never told the person not to do it. Why can the person sue? Because it's obviously against the nature of that airplane. In this case, it would be harmful to that airplane to do so. It wasn't made for that. So we see in the nature of airplane a sort of natural law. So in the case of God in nature, God is like the owner, that we receive the the law from God, but the details of that law is found in our nature, right? Just like the airplane has an owner, the reason we can't harm it is because of the owner, but the details of what we can and can't do to it is found in the nature of the airplane. So let's get on to the very first rule of law that we can find in natural law is the right to life. It's simple, right? God created us, so God wants us to live. And here's one point where we see that already right at the beginning, natural law and law of nature will diverge, right? Because natural law, in the right to life, natural law tells us that we don't have the right to commit suicide, right? So the right to life tells us not only that we may not murder, but that we may not kill ourselves. Why? Because it's God wants us to live. Our rights come from God. But if we were to go to law of nature, people see our right to life as something that we own and that we can choose to have it or not have it. So law of nature allows suicide, while natural law prohibits it. So we can ask another question. Well, God created a carrot. Does a carrot have a right to life? Right? Can we take a carrot out of the ground and eat it? Well, in order to consider this, we have to look at what things are made for. What was the carrot made for? The carrot was made for taking it out of the ground and eating it. And so therefore we can do that with a carrot, right? And so again, we're seeing the natural law in the nature of the things that God created, right? One last point that you need to know is that natural law is written in the human heart. And you can see this because things that go against the natural law tend to naturally make us uncomfortable, right? Something in the back of our mind says that doesn't seem right. And I'll give an example. Say the case of reconstructive surgery or augmentation of the body, right? Let's say somebody ends up in an accident and scarred face, and you want to restore that person's face. Or in another case, somebody just wants a facelift, right? One of them we would encourage, the other, something about that is not right. And that's because restoring the body to its original state is not against natural law, but trying to augment it like we can do better than God is against natural law. And so in our natural inclinations tend to agree with the natural reasoning of natural law. In regard, I know that some people may have had facelift or some other similar type of surgery. You need to know that the act of changing the body for augmentation is against natural law, but not the change itself. In other words, if you already have the change, you're not perpetually against natural law. It doesn't work that way. It's the actual changing that is against natural law. And therefore, there is not an obligation to revert it. Although reverting it is permitted because it is an act of restoration. So that's a quick overview of natural law. We could definitely go a whole lot deeper here, but in the interest of time, we'll have to start there. But I just want enough to get you started in thinking about it. In the next section, we're actually going to go into a full-fledged example. We're going to look at abortion, the question of abortion from the perspective of natural law.